Well, thanks, Laurie, for that introduction. I can think of no more complex, vexed policy area than that of asylum seekers. It draws strong emotions from the community, and since taking this portfolio, I've learnt a surprising number of obscenities can actually be squeezed into 140 characters. And it in turn demands robust answers to complex questions. Answers to the questions that come from facing the cruel reality that some 7 million people are seeking permanent asylum in the world today. The appalling questions of how many people should we resettle? Which people should we resettle? To whom do we say no? And how do we make this devil's choice? You see, the wicked reality which underpins this area of policy is that whether it's Greens, Liberals or Labor, we are all left saying no to millions of worthy who are seeking refuge. Any intelligent observer of it should immediately be wary of the politician who merely offers a simple slogan as a solution. Precisely because of this complexity, if you intend to navigate asylum seeker policy, you better be clear about your values in the process. The boarding of the Tampa in 2001 was a moment of political rupture for our country, and particularly for immigration policy. As the Liberals drove our public debate off a cliff of xenophobia, Labor made a mistake, which was perhaps understandable in the midst of this storm. Our immediate focus was on the unprecedented events unfolding at sea, and in that process we did not articulate, in my view, the values which underpinned our actions. As we made difficult decisions in government and now take difficult positions in opposition, it's not enough to get the policy settings right. We also need to win the battle of believability. And to do so, we must articulate what it is that we stand for. There is no doubt that the values that drive modern Labor are compassion, fairness and generosity. A fundamental maxim that we as a country should not harm people. Compassion does lead us to seek an end to the loss of life at sea. Fairness leads us to empower the UNHCR in helping us make the choice of who should qualify for our humanitarian program rather than leaving that to people smugglers. And generosity leads us to increase our humanitarian program. And through it all, we must ensure that we never harm people as a form of deterrence. While the policy questions are complex, the politics of boats is crystal clear. We decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. Former Prime Minister John Howard spoke those words in October 2001 during his election campaign. A few words intended as a rallying call to voters pressing buttons about our sovereignty that signalled the beginning of more than a decade of dog whistling, policy tussling, soul-searching, loss of life and the ugliest side of political cunning. This has been an appalling debate for Australia. People that faced perilous circumstances at home, risking their lives at sea, elicited not compassion, but instead were castigated on our airwaves, in our parliament and on suburban streets, branded as illegals. In the post-September 11 landscape, people were understandably anxious, and the ground was fertile for people's anxieties to be exploited, including by the shock jocks warning of Sharia law coming to a suburb near you. The Liberals had seized upon the worries of a public facing an unknown terror threat and whipped this frenzy into a political tide. We were all the poorer for this. By 2007, the vessels attempting to reach our shores were few. 5 boats arrived in that year. The people smugglers were devoid of technology we have now, still operating in relatively primitive circumstances without easily accessible smartphones and GPS. While our offshore processing centres remained open, only a handful of people were in them. The strong call from the electorate at the 2007 election was to end offshore processing and abolish temporary protection visas. In early 2008, the last refugees left Nauru. There was barely a whimper from the Liberal Party. While no vessels were arriving, and comparatively few did through 2008, the nature of the problem was about to change. 2009 marked a significant change with a spike in the number of people on the move worldwide. This was reflected in a renewed interest by smugglers in getting people to Australia, particularly Afghan Hazaras and Sri Lankans. It is unlikely the Howard government's policy would have been effective in halting the flow given these changing circumstances. People smugglers had learnt they could still market Australia as a destination, albeit one that required a detour at Nauru. Indonesia's concerns with turnbacks meant this was not an active policy in the last days of the Howard government. And the evidence of TPVs has always been that they increase asylum seeker vessels because under a TPV, a boat is the only means possible to effect a family reunion. And so, the next influx of asylum seeker vessels began. From the immediate moment the asylum seeker vessels began to reappear, Labor immediately set about trying to calibrate a solution to stopping them. While it would have been far from a magic fix in stemming this tide of asylum seekers, I believe had we maintained offshore processing, it would have removed any element of incentive. That was the conclusion of the Houston report, which Labor endorsed in 2012. In 2010, we saw the Christmas Island tragedy followed by a period which saw the sea voyage from Java to Christmas Island become the most dangerous journey in pursuit of refuge anywhere in the world. And it raised in the process another difficult question. Did Australia have any obligation in relation to the loss of life on our borders? There are many voices in the debate today calling for the closure of Australia's offshore processing. These voices speak from compassion, and I respect them and recognise the humanity that they bring to a terrible debate. But if compassion is our touchstone, I cannot see how Australia does not accept an obligation surrounding this terrible journey. This was an appalling situation and it had to be stopped. Be it the reintroduction of offshore processing or the work of the expert panel chaired by Air Chief Marshal Angus Houston, Labor sought to do all it could to solve the problem. But the most significant proposal was the Malaysian arrangement. With the decision of the High Court, this proposition was put squarely in the hands of the Parliament. And it is at this point that the Coalition's approach to dealing with the question of asylum seeker policy unravels as nothing other than political opportunism. In following a strict order of obstructionism, Scott Morrison denied Labor cooperation at every turn. He ran a joint ticket with the Greens to bring down the Malaysian arrangement. With the Malaysian arrangement needing a lifeline in the Parliament, Tony Abbott was brutal in tossing it aside. A letter to the Prime Minister in which he rebuked her request for bipartisanship with a stinging, "This is your mess, you fix it." Let me be clear about what the Malaysian arrangement would have done. Scott Morrison says that turning back boats at sea has stopped vessels coming to Australia. While the government hasn't told us how many asylum seekers have been turned around since December, based on the numbers of people arriving as reported weekly last year, it can be no more than 200 or 300. The Malaysian arrangement provided for the effective turnaround of 800 people. By Scott Morrison's own logic, we see crudely paraded via a daily scoreboard, it would have solved this problem almost 3 years ago. Yet the Coalition grasped at a multitude of reasons why they were saying no to the Malaysian arrangement. We have seen Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party try and crudely lay at the feet of Labor the tragedy of those who died at sea. The truth is that ruthless people smugglers are to blame for these deaths. But if Mr Morrison is to continue to indulge in his running tally on our borders, then it is important to know that 689 of those deaths at sea occurred after the Coalition rejected the Malaysian arrangement. I cannot point to a more ruthlessly opportunistic exploitation of a terrible situation than what Scott Morrison and the Coalition did in relation to scuttling the Malaysian arrangement. And if we were to believe the concerns he raised at the time about Malaysia, how does that sit with his negotiations now with Cambodia? His hypocrisy is inescapable. The point I draw to all this is that opposition for opportunistic value must not be allowed to permeate this policy area ever again, and it won't under my watch. Unlike our time in power, the Abbott government does now and will continue to have the support of Labor in bringing to an end the flow of asylum seeker vessels to Australia. But that does not mean for a minute that we have written the Coalition a blank cheque. The lasting policy Labor implemented in government was the PNG arrangement. There has been no more important act by an Australian government in reducing the flow of asylum seeker vessels than this. By securing an agreement with the government of PNG to have those persons found to be refugees at the Manus Island detention facility resettled in PNG, Australia was, for the first time, taken off the table as a permanent resettlement destination. Spreading the word through the networks of people smugglers that taking to the sea offers no chance of ever being resettled in Australia is the only effective way to deter people from making this risky journey. Within 2 months, by the time of the election, vessels that had arrived had dropped by 90%, whereas 19 arrived in the week of 19 July last year. By the first week of September, that number was down to 3. And there those numbers stayed until mid-December, despite the government not putting in place a single other piece of substantive policy during that time. But the success of the PNG arrangement should ultimately be measured by the fact that since the day of its implementation, on 19 July last year, 312 days, we have not seen a single loss of life at sea. This is the real daily count that we should note. Today, Labor continues to stand for compassion in doing all that is necessary to bring an end to the loss of life at sea. We support offshore processing at Nauru and Manus Island as a step which has saved lives. But this does not absolve the government from their obligations to ensure that Manus Island is a place which is safe, dignified and humane. Why is that such a hard sentiment for Mr Morrison to express? Why is this such a hard outcome for the Liberal government to implement? The death of Reza Barati in an Australian paid facility is truly shocking. Outbreaks of violence, harm and abuse have no place in detention facilities of which we are a part. It is clear from the Cornell report released yesterday that the government breached its duty of care to those persons at Manus Island. It did so by ignoring the repeated advice to upgrade security, including fencing and lighting. It also did so by neglecting the critical relationship with the Papua New Guinean government. The fact that Scott Morrison hastily convened a ministerial forum only after the tragic violence occurred, 8 months after taking ownership of the facility, is a serious breach of his ministerial responsibility. there still remain unanswered questions about his conduct and response to the repeated warnings he personally received about the need to improve security. Today, Labor stands for fairness by working with bodies such as the UNHCR to determine where best to deploy our humanitarian program for the greatest benefit. As those arriving by sea have filled up the available places in the humanitarian program, the voiceless in this debate are people in camps such as Dadaab in Kenya or Yida in South Sudan, which I visited last year. Languishing in these camps are the world's most vulnerable. Today, Labor also stands for generosity by seeing an increase in the size of our humanitarian program. We are a rich country. We must be doing more. The Abbott government's slashing of the humanitarian program speaks of a mean, selfish streak that permeates much of its immigration policies. By the end of the Labor government, we had increased the humanitarian program to 20,000. That would have increased over the course of our next term had we been re-elected, and that would have been the right thing to do and signalled a system that is fair, compassionate and generous. The government's mean-spirited approach has also played out in Mr Morrison's dogged determination to use temporary protection visas. Let's be clear. Unless TPVs are to be offered to people arriving after the 19th of July last year, which would in itself amount to putting Australia back on the table, their only role will be in relation to the 30,000 asylum seekers who are already in Australia. As such, by definition, TPVs cannot act as a deterrent. TPVs leave those who are on them in limbo. They are costly, they are short-sighted and create a cycle of despair and dependence. Another area of this government's policy which raises concern is the approach it has taken to turnbacks at sea. There is a scant level of information in the public domain to adequately inform us about what is actually occurring. Turning around rickety boats at sea is fraught with danger for our servicemen and women and those aboard the vessels. As such, we remain concerned about safety at sea. But the other critical risk is to our relationship with Indonesia. The clandestine Operation Sovereign Borders is corroding this relationship. There is no more vivid demonstration of this point than the fact it caused the cancellation of a Prime Ministerial visit to Indonesia which was intended to heal the rift. This is the nonsense of pursuing a policy of regional cooperation from an autocratic standpoint, and a guns-blazing, go-it-alone effort to rule our seas will not work over the long term. We simply must work with Indonesia and our neighbours on this issue. Labor supports a regional solution to this global challenge. The relationship with our neighbours is a significant point of difference between Labor and the Coalition. For where we stand for regional cooperation on asylum seekers with Malaysia and Indonesia, or with PNG and Nauru, the actions of the Abbott government make it abundantly clear that they stand for unilateralism, and this is not sustainable. While there is much work which needs to be done before Labor settles on the precise policy that it will take to the next election, there are some important observations that can be made now. Central to our position will be a continued support for offshore processing and the PNG arrangement. We will also stand for humanity and dignity in the way that that system operates. And Labor will stand for a significant increase in our humanitarian program befitting a wealthy country with a generous heart offering a fair go. One of the collateral impacts of the asylum seeker issue is that it has allowed very little room for talk of anything else in the immigration area. I believe the government has no focus, interest or depth to look beyond the scoreboard of arrivals. Scott Morrison will be typecast as the hard man of our borders, and that may suit him for his future political ambitions. But the immigration space is much more than chest beating on the good days and deathly silence on the bad ones. Below the politics lies a debate about the critical role immigration will play in our future economy, acknowledging the wonderful role that immigration has played in forging contemporary Australia. Bob Hawke once said that the great influx of migrants after the Second World War is the most defining feature of Australia today, and he's right. And so beyond the toxic politics around asylum seekers, we want to have that debate. We want to enliven it. And we want to talk about immigration policy not with fear, but with pride in our past and optimism for our future. Thank you.